She drove the graveyard shift with her 11-month-old asleep in the back seat, strapped into a car seat she'd bought used for $12. And the man she picked up at 2:14 that morning was worth $6 billion. Though neither of them knew yet that he owed her his life. Her name was Renata Das. She had $19.03 in her checking account and $40 between her and the number that mattered, and she took the dead-hour fare because it paid an extra 90 cents, and 90 cents was 90 cents. She was not supposed to have the baby in the car. She knew that. She had nowhere to leave him at 2 in the morning. So he came, the way he came every night, riding the length of Kensington in the dark, while his mother drove strangers home. The man who slid into the back seat on Allegheny Avenue did not look like $6 billion. He looked wrecked, gray, folded into his coat like a man leaving a hospital, which he was. He gave the address and said nothing else. And at the red light on Frankfurt, when the baby stirred, Nita reached one arm back without looking and pressed 2 fingers to his small wrist. A nurse's habit, 9 years deep, checking a pulse she didn't need to check. Elliot Vance saw the 2 fingers. And Elliot Vance stopped breathing. Not because of the taped seat. Not because of the coins in the cup holder, or the diaper bag, or the exhaustion coming off her in waves. He had seen poverty before. Poverty did not stop his breath. It was the gesture. 2 fingers, that exact placement, that exact quiet. He had felt it once, 6 years ago, from a gloved hand he never saw, in the worst hour of his life, and he had been looking for that hand ever since. 58 years old. A man who owned the hospital system she used to work for. And he had spent 6 years unable to find the one nurse who had kept him alive. She didn't know who he was. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. To understand Renata Das, you have to start on Ruth Street, in the row house where her grandmother raised her, on the 1900 block, in the years when the block still had all its teeth. Ozella Das worked the overnight desk at a nursing home on Somerset for 31 years. 31 years of nights. She would come home at 7 in the morning with her feet swollen and her uniform smelling of the place. And she would sit at the kitchen table and drink 1 cup of coffee before she slept, and she would tell her granddaughter the same thing she told her every morning of her childhood. You don't leave a body alone in the dark. Somebody stays. That's the whole job. Somebody stays. Ozella did not mean it as poetry. She meant it as instruction. She had watched people die on her shift, old people, forgotten people, people whose children lived 40 minutes away and could not be bothered to make the drive, and she had decided a long time ago that she would be the one in the room. Not because it paid. It did not pay. She made a little over minimum wage for 3 decades and never once got a raise that kept up with the rent. She stayed because staying was the thing itself. The staying was the care. Everything else was paperwork. That was it. That was the whole of it. There was a specific night Nita never forgot, though she'd been maybe 9 when it happened. Ozella had come home later than usual, past 8, and she had not gone to bed. She had sat at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and her hands flat on the wood, not moving. A man on her floor had died in the night. Coleman, no family that came, a veteran, 91, and Ozella had been the one holding his hand when he went. Because there was no one else, because there was never anyone else. That was the whole reason the job existed. She told her granddaughter about it plainly, the way she told her everything, no drama in it. And then she said the thing that Nita would carry into every trauma bay for the rest of her working life. She said, the dying don't ask for much at the end. They don't ask you to fix it. They just ask you not to leave them in it alone. That's all it is, baby. Somebody stays. On Sundays they went to Mount Zion Aim over on Somerset, and the same principal wore a different dress there. The church looked after its own the way Ozella looked after the dying, practically without announcement. A woman named Miss Pearl kept a list of who on the block had fallen behind on what, and the list was never spoken of, and the help arrived through a covered dish or a paid light bill or an envelope pressed into a hand after service with nothing written on it. Nita grew up inside that. She grew up understanding that care was not a feeling you had about people. It was a thing you did for them, quietly, at cost to yourself, and you did not make them thank you for it, because thanking turned help into charity, and charity had a way of making people smaller. You just stayed. You just showed up. You left the light on and you did not brag about the electric bill. Nita grew up on that. She grew up carrying it. And when she went into nursing, when she got her RN and worked 9 years, most of them in trauma and the ICU, most of them nights, because nights was where the need was. She carried it into every room she walked into. She was the nurse who stayed past her shift. She was the nurse who caught the thing the residents missed because she was still in the room when everybody else had moved on. Somebody stays. It was the best of her. It was in the end the thing that got her destroyed, though she did not know that yet, and neither did anyone else. That was the woman. This was the night. The night was $19 and a car that needed an oil change she kept deferring. The night was a folded envelope in the glove box from Landmark Residential Management, the third such envelope informing Tenant R, DOS of Unit 4B, that she was now 3 payments and $847 behind, and that the next letter would not be a letter. The night was a baby who should have been in a crib and a 7-year-old who was, right now, asleep at a neighbor's because Nita could not be in 2 places, and the rent did not care about the logistics of single motherhood. The night was $41.60 in fares if it went well before gas, and it rarely went well. She did the math the way she did all her math, in her head at red lights in the dark. $300 a week if she drove every night without breaking. $1,200 a month. Rent was $950. That left $250 for a family of 3, for food, for gas, for the baby, for the pass that kept sending envelopes. It did not work. She knew it did not work. She drove anyway. Because the alternative to driving was standing still, and standing still was the one thing her grandmother had taught her never to do. 2 nights before, she had done a different kind of inventory, in the fluorescent light of the Save-A-Lot on Kensington Avenue, with the baby on her hip and a hand basket that was not a cart because a cart implied a certain volume of purchase she was not going to reach. She had put things in and taken things out. A store-brand box of infant oatmeal. A gallon of milk whole because the baby needed the fat, $3.89. A loaf of bread the day-old rack, 99 cents. A bag of the little clementines because Amara loved them and they were on sale, $2.99. Peanut butter, the plain label jar. A box of macaroni, 4 for $1, and she took 3. Eggs, the 18 count, because eggs were the cheapest protein God ever made. And then, at the register, when the total came to more than she had budgeted, she took the clementines back out. She handed them to the teenager working the belt and said she'd changed her mind, and she watched him set the mesh bag aside, and she carried the rest out to the car. There was nothing in the bag for her. No coffee. No snack she might have wanted for herself. No lotion. No small thing. Nothing she could hold at the end of a shift and call hers. She had not bought a single thing for herself in so long that she had stopped noticing the absence, which is its own kind of arithmetic, the kind that does not show up on any receipt. At home on the visor there was a drawing. Her daughter Amara was 7 and drew constantly, on the backs of the envelopes and on napkins and on the free paper they gave out at the library, and lately she drew the same picture over and over. A tall stick figure in what was clearly meant to be scrubs standing next to a small bed, and beside the bed always a lamp. Amara drew the lamp with careful yellow lines coming off it, a child's shorthand for light, except that in every version the lamp was drawn but never colored in, the bulb left blank, the light not yet switched on. Nita never asked her why. She thought she understood. It was her, the tall figure. It was the nights. Her daughter had drawn her mother as the person who stands by the bed in the dark and had left the light for later. Nita kept the drawing on the visor and did not talk about it. The block, though, the block talked. The block always talked. Big Wendell ran the corner store at Ruth and Cambria, had run it for 20 years, and Wendell knew everything that happened on those 3 blocks the way a man knows the sound of his own house settling at night. He knew Nita's grandmother. He knew Nita as a girl in a church dress on her way to Mount Zion Aim, and he knew things had gotten bad. He didn't need to be told. He saw the car leave every night at 10. He saw it come back every morning at 6. He saw the 7-year-old on the milk crate outside his store some afternoons with a juice box he had not charged for. So Wendell did what people on that block had always done, which was to handle it quietly among themselves before any outsider ever thought to. He started keeping Amara some nights, him and his wife, so the girl wasn't shuffled between neighbors. He'd wave off the thanks. He put a coffee can on the counter one week. No sign on it, no explanation, just a can, and by Friday there was $61 in it from people who had their own envelopes, their own overnight shifts, their own arithmetic, and who put $1 in anyway. That was the block. That was the thing the news never showed when it showed Kensington. The block looked after its own first. It did not wait to be rescued. It had never once, in its whole history, been rescued by anyone who wasn't already standing on it. When Wendell tried to give Nita the coffee can money, she would not take it. Not as charity. She stood in his store with the baby and told him she'd take work. She'd stock his shelves, she'd do his books, she was good with numbers. But she would not take a handout, because taking a handout was a different thing than doing a job, and her grandmother's granddaughter did not stand in a doorway with her hand out. Wendell looked at her a long moment. Then he said he did need help with the books, which was half a lie and half not, and that was how they both kept their dignity intact. That was the woman. This was the night. The night was $19, and a car that needed an oil change she kept deferring. The night was a folded envelope in the glove box from Landmark Residential Management, the third such envelope, informing Tenant R. DOS of Unit 4B that she was now 3 payments and 3,847 behind, and that the next letter would not be a letter. 3 payments. 3,008. The next letter would not be a letter. It would be a person, with a clipboard and a court date, and the authority to put her children's things on the sidewalk. The night was a baby who should have been in a crib and a 7-year-old who was, right now, asleep at Wendell's because Nita could not be in 2 places, and the rent did not care about the logistics of single motherhood. The night was $41.60 in fares if it went well before gas. It rarely went well. Now cut across the city 6 years back to a man on a table. Elliot Vance did not remember most of it. What he remembered came in fragments the way trauma comes back. The ceiling lights of an operating room at Delray General, the particular cold of the place, a pressure in his chest that felt less like pain than like a door closing. He had gone in for a procedure that was supposed to be routine. Something had gone wrong. A vessel, a bleed, an internal hemorrhage the surgical residents did not catch fast enough because the floor was short-staffed that night, and the monitors were telling a story nobody was in the room to read. Somebody read it. He never saw her. He was intubated by then, going under, the world narrowing to a pinhole. But he felt, and this is the part he could never explain to anyone, the part that sounded like sentiment coming out of a man who did not do sentiment, that in the middle of the alarms and the residents talking over each other and the particular chaos of a body coming apart on a table at 3 in the morning on an understaffed floor where the odds said he should have died, one hand found his wrist and held it, 2 fingers, steady, unhurried, the way you touch someone you have decided not to leave. And a voice attached to that hand said a number and a word. Flat. Certain. The whole room turned. The bleed got found. The second team came in. His life against the arithmetic of that particular night got kept. Kept. That was the word for it. He would think about that word for years. Then they transferred him to a better hospital, a private one, the kind a man like him was supposed to be in. And the nurse who caught it stayed behind at Delray General, on the overnight floor, and he never learned her name. He tried. This is the thing about Elliot Vance that his board did not know and his brother did not understand. For 6 years he had tried to find her. He had the resources to find almost anything. He owned a hospital staffing conglomerate, Vance Meridian, $6.2 billion in market cap, his name on the buildings. And he could not find one night nurse, because the records at Delray General from that period were, when he finally went looking, incomplete. Scrubbed, though he did not yet know that word applied. There was a gap where she should have been. He had put people on it. He had twice quietly hired firms whose entire business was finding people who did not want to be found. Both times they came back with the same shrug. The shift records for that stretch at Delray were a mess. The staffing agency that ran the floor had been absorbed and reorganized, personnel files consolidated and, in places, lost. One investigator used the word sanitized, and then walked it back when Elliot's face changed. A hospital that loses 6 years of accurate night shift records is either badly run or covering something, and Elliot had assumed, the way rich men assume, that it was simply incompetence. He would learn otherwise. But that was later. There was a reason it would not let him go, and the reason had a name, and the name was Diane. But that wound came later in the telling too, and Elliot kept it where he kept everything that mattered, which was nowhere anyone could see. For now there was only the fact of it. A man who could buy almost anything, who could not buy back the one debt he actually owed, the debt of his own continued breathing, to a woman whose hand he had felt for 4 seconds and whose face he had never once seen. 2 worlds. A woman who stayed for strangers until it cost her everything and did not know she had once saved a king. A man who owed his life to a hand he could not find, sitting now tonight in the back seat of her car, watching her check a baby's pulse at a red light on Frankfurt Avenue, feeling the floor of his stomach fall away. And here is the thing neither of them could have known that night. The same company that made Elliot Vance a billionaire was the exact machine that reached into a hospital on Allegheny Avenue and erased the nurse who saved him, flagged her, fired her, let her license die. So that the debt he carried and the wound she lived in were not 2 stories, but one, folded closed, waiting in the dark for someone to open it. Somebody stays. Neither of them said it out loud. But one of them was about to remember it, and the other was about to be found. Not tonight. Not all at once. But soon. The card declined on a Tuesday. She was at the Save-A-Lot on Kensington Avenue again, the baby on her hip, a handbasket with the essentials, and she swiped, and the little screen said declined in that flat gray font that does not care who is watching. There were 3 people behind her. A man with a case of water, a girl in a Wawa uniform, an older woman with a cart who had already started to sigh. Nita swiped again, declined again. She knew what was in the account. She knew it to the cent. 19 threes had become 6 11s after gas, but knowing did not make the screen say anything different, and it did not make the line behind her any shorter. There is a particular arithmetic that happens in that moment, and every mother who has stood in that line knows it. You do not think about the shame. There is no time for the shame comes later at night. In the moment you think about the order of operations, what goes back first? What the children actually need versus what you had hoped to give them. Milk or eggs? Not both. The clementines were never even in the basket this time. She had learned that lesson already. She put the milk back. She put the eggs back. She kept the infant oatmeal and the bread and handed the rest across the belt to the teenager, the same one from before, who did not look at her, which was its own kind of mercy. She paid 5 and 40s in coins and singles. She carried what was left out to the car. She strapped the baby in. She did not cry in the parking lot, because crying in the parking lot was a luxury of time she did not have, and there was a fare waiting 3 blocks away, and the fare paid, and the crying did not. That night, at home, she made a plate for Amara and a bottle for Marcus, and she stood at the counter while they ate. She was not hungry, she told Amara. She'd eaten at work. It was the kind of lie a mother tells that a 7-year-old half believes and half files away for later, the way children file the things they are not supposed to understand yet. There was a jar of peanut butter and half a sleeve of crackers in the cabinet, and after the children were asleep, Nita ate 4 crackers standing up, in the dark, and called it dinner, and did the math on the counter with a pen on the back of an envelope. Rent $950. Out $3,847. In the account $6.11. Fares last week $219. Gas $61. Diapers a box every 9 days $24.99. Amara's field trip permission slip still on the fridge unsigned because the fee was $11, and $11 was a tank of gas, and a tank of gas was 3 nights of work. She wrote the numbers in a column the way her grandmother had taught her to, and she added them, and she subtracted, and the bottom of the column came out the way it always came out. Short. Not a little short. Short the way a bridge is short when it does not reach the other side. And the worst number was not any of the ones she could write down. The worst number was the one she could not calculate. How many nights were left before the letter that was not a letter? She sat with the pen and could not solve for it, and a nurse who could read a monitor in 4 seconds and tell you exactly how long a body had. That nurse could not tell you how long she had. That was the cruelty of it. She had spent 9 years knowing exactly how much time other people had left. She had no idea how much she did. To understand how a 9-year trauma nurse ended up doing arithmetic on the back of an eviction notice, you have to understand a man she had never met, in an office she had never seen, 40 floors above a city that was not even hers to look at. His name was Gregory Vance. Gregory was 52 years old and the chief operating officer of the staffing arm of Vance Meridian Health, the same company his older half-brother Elliot had built, though Gregory did not build it and never forgave the arithmetic of that either. Elliot founded. Gregory operated. Elliot's name went on the buildings. Gregory's name went on the memos nobody was supposed to read. And the memos said, in the flattened language that money uses when it does not want to look at itself, that the staffing subsidiary would improve margins by moving hospital floors from what the contracts called legacy ratios to optimized coverage. Optimized coverage meant fewer nurses. That is the whole translation. A floor that used to run 1 nurse for every 4 patients would now run 1 for every 6, then 1 for every 8. The difference between those numbers, the 2 extra bodies per nurse, the double detention, the half time at each bed, that difference was the margin. That difference was money. Gregory Vance did not think of it as bodies. He thought of it as a spreadsheet. And on a spreadsheet, a nurse is a line item called labor, and labor is a cost, and costs are things you optimize. He was good at his job. His division's numbers were excellent. He was by every measure his brother's board used a success. He was not cruel, exactly. That is the thing the story has to be honest about. He did not walk hospital floors at night and watch what his numbers did. He never saw the floor at 3 a.m. with 1 nurse and 14 patients and a monitor going off in a room she could not get to yet. He optimized coverage from 40 floors up, in a room with good coffee, and he told himself, the way men in that room always tell themselves, that if the numbers were bad, the market would correct them, and the market had not corrected them, so the numbers were fine. That was his math. Whether it was the right math is a question the people on those floors answered every night, in a language Gregory never had to hear. And here is where the story has to stop and tell you something true, because the story is invented but the floors are not. In the United States, the connection between how many nurses are on a hospital floor and whether patients on that floor live or die is not an opinion. It has been measured repeatedly for decades. A landmark national study estimated that if every hospital raised its nurse staffing to match the best-staffed hospitals, roughly 5,000 in-hospital patient deaths and 60,000 adverse outcomes could be avoided every year. And the danger is not spread evenly across the clock. Research on cardiac arrests in hospitals has found that the risk of dying from a cardiac arrest is nearly 20% higher on the night shift, and the researchers named the reason plainly. Most hospitals cut their nurse-to-patient ratios at night, and lower ratios have been associated with a higher risk of exactly the kind of collapse that kills people in the dark. 20% higher. At night. When there is 1 nurse where there should be 2. That is not a number Gregory Vance kept on his spreadsheet, but it is the number that ran invisibly underneath every margin he ever optimized. And it is the number that had, 6 years earlier, on one particular understaffed night, come within 4 minutes of killing his own brother. 4 minutes. That was the margin. Not the financial one. The other one. Because that is what the night nurse caught. Elliot Vance had gone into an emergency procedure at Delray General on a night when the floor was running Gregory's optimized coverage, 1 nurse for too many beds, residents stretched thin, monitors telling a story nobody had time to read. A vessel gave way. An internal bleed started, quiet, the kind that does not announce itself until it is nearly too late, and the residents missed it, because missing things is what happens on a floor with no one left in the room. And a nurse who was not even assigned to him, a nurse who had stayed past her shift because staying was the thing she did, walked past, saw the number, understood the number, and forced the call that got the bleed found and the second team in. She never knew who he was. He was a chart and a crisis and a risk she took for 4 seconds. She saved him. She went back to her other patients. There were always other patients. And the floor did not stop being understaffed just because a life had been kept. Her name, of course, was Renata Doss. But it would be a long time before anyone put those two facts in the same sentence. There was a second thing the night did to Elliot Vance, and it is the thing that explains why he could not let the nurse go, why a man that rich spent 6 years and 2 investigators chasing a hand he felt once. Because Elliot lived. But 2 years later his wife did not. Her name was Diane. She went into a hospital, a good one, a private one, the kind a billionaire's wife is supposed to be safe in, for something that should have been routine. On the 3rd night on an understaffed floor in the small hours she deteriorated. No one was in the room to read it. By the time someone was, it was too late. Elliot was told she died peacefully. He learned later, from a nurse who would not meet his eyes, that peacefully was the word the hospital used, and that the truer word was alone. Diane Vance died in the dark, on a night shift, on a floor that did not have enough people on it, and nobody stayed. Nobody stayed. That is the wound Elliot Vance carried into the back seat of a rideshare car at 2:14 in the morning. He had been saved by a stranger who stayed, and he had lost his wife because no one did, and he had spent the years since unable to look at a hospital floor or a spreadsheet or his own brother, without hearing the same question underneath everything. Who is in the room? Who stays? He did not yet know that the answer to the first question and the cause of the second were the same company. His company. His name on the buildings. Back on Ruth Street, the block did what the block did. Big Wendell had watched the car come home later each morning, and he had done the arithmetic that neighbors do, and one evening he set the coffee can on the counter, the one from before, quietly refilled, and this time it had $140 in it. 1s and 5s mostly. A church envelope from Miss Pearl with a 20 folded inside and nothing written on it. Money from people who did not have it to give and gave it anyway, because that was the block, because Kensington had been looking after its own for 100 years before any camera crew ever came to film how bad it had gotten. Wendell tried to give it to her. He set it on the counter of his own store and slid it toward her and told her it wasn't charity, it was the block, it was hers. Nita would not take it. She stood there with Marcus on her hip and told him, not angry, just certain, in the voice she got from Ozella, that she could not take money she had not earned, that the day she started taking money she had not earned was the day she stopped being able to look her daughter in the eye. She said she'd work for it. She'd do his books, stock his cooler, mop the floor. She said a lot of things in the indirect way pride talks when it is trying not to sound like pride. And then she said one thing plainly that ended it. I don't need saving, Wendell. I need a job. Wendell looked at her a long moment. Then he said, all right, the books were a mess, and he'd been meaning to ask, and he'd pay her what he could, and they both let the coffee can sit there between them as the fiction it had to be. She took the work. She would not take the gift. That distinction was the whole of who she was, and it was, though neither of them knew it, the same distinction that had gotten her fired. Because a woman who will not stop doing the right thing at cost to herself is an asset on a hospital floor and a liability on a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet always wins the argument in the room where the spreadsheet is the only thing that talks. 40 floors up that argument had a clerk. His name was Tomas Reyes Lynn, and he was 29, and he was Gregory Vance's assistant, and on a Thursday afternoon he was asked to do a thing he did not fully understand and would spend a long time trying to forget. He was given a personnel file, an old one, a nurse's from Delray General from years back, and told to process a records reconciliation. Move certain incident reports to an archive. Void a flagged escalation. Update a licensing status field from active to lapsed pending review. Routine cleanup, Gregory called it. Left over from the old subsidiary consolidation. Tomas did not read the name closely. You learn in that building not to read names closely. But he noticed one thing, because he could not help noticing it. The escalation he was told to void was not a complaint against the nurse. It was a commendation adjacent note, a record of a catch, a life saved. Someone had flagged it, years ago, and someone else had signed off on burying it, and the signature on the sign-off was one Tomas recognized, and he sat for a moment with his hand on the mouse, uneasy, before he did what he was told, because he had a lease and a student loan and a job in a building where you did not read names closely. He processed it. He archived the file. He voided the note. He did not sleep well that night, and he did not know why, and the reason had a name he had not let himself read, and a signature he had recognized and was trying very hard to forget. Somebody stays, Ozella used to say. It is the whole job. That night, on 3 separate floors of the same story, a woman eating crackers in the dark, a man who could not stop hearing the word alone, a clerk who had just helped erase the proof. Nobody stayed. Not yet. But the file was not as gone as Gregory Vance believed, and the nurse was closer than any of them knew, and the debt was already in the car. Elliot Vance did not sleep the night of the ride. He got home, the penthouse, the one Diane had chosen the drapes for, and never lived to sit in properly. And he sat in the dark with his coat still on, and he did the thing rich men do when something has cracked them open, which is that he reached for the only tool he trusted. He reached for data. He had felt the gesture. 2 fingers, that exact placement, that flat certainty. He had felt it once before, 6 years ago, and he had spent 6 years and 2 firms trying to find the hand. And now the hand had reached back over a car seat at a red light on Frankfurt Avenue and checked a baby's pulse. And Elliot Vance needed to know if he was losing his mind or if the world had just closed a circle in the dark. So he went back to the beginning, to the night at Delray General. He had the resources to reconstruct almost anything, and this time he did not hire it out. He did it himself, at 3 in the morning, the way you do the thing that matters most. He pulled what records existed from that night, the surgical log, the transfer paperwork, the fragments that survived. And this time he was not looking for a name. He was looking for a shift. Who was working the overnight floor at Delray General? On the night, his heart stopped and someone caught the bleed the residents missed. And this is where the machine his own company built turned for one moment against the man at the top of it. Because the records were scrubbed. He had known that for years, the gap, the sanitized, the investigator had walked back. But he had always assumed incompetence, a consolidation gone sloppy, files lost in a merger. Now he was looking with different eyes, and what he saw was not the shape of an accident. It was the shape of a decision. Someone had gone into those records and removed a specific night, a specific escalation, a specific nurse, cleanly, deliberately, the way you do not lose a file but disappear one. And a man does not spend 30 years in business without learning the difference between a thing that broke and a thing that was broken on purpose. He found the edge of it. Not the whole file, that was gone, but the edge, the negative space where the file had been. A shift roster with one line redacted. An incident number that led to an archive that led to a void. And in the metadata of the void, a reconciliation timestamp, recent from his own company's staffing subsidiary. His division. His brother's division. He sat with that for a long time. He did not yet let himself finish the thought, because the thought was too large and too dark, and Elliot Vance was a careful man who did not act on a thing until he was certain of it. But he had a shape now. A woman who had saved his life, whose record had been deliberately erased by the company that bore his name, who was, and this was the part that made him set the laptop down and put his face in his hands, who was, 6 years later, driving a rideshare car through Kensington at 2 in the morning with a baby in the back seat because she had, somehow, been destroyed. He did not know how. He did not know the how yet. But he knew the shape, and the shape was unbearable. Here is the thing the story has to say plainly in the narrator's own voice, because it is the thesis under everything. Care is not a feeling. It is not the warmth you feel when you hear a sad story. Care is who is still in the room at 3 in the morning. It is the hand on the wrist when the monitor goes quiet. And a system that runs on people staying, that depends entirely on nurses who stay past their shift, and neighbors who keep a coffee can, and grandmothers who sit with the dying. A system that runs on those people and then punishes the ones who stay is not broken. That is the mistake everyone makes, calling it broken. It is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. It is just working for someone else. Elliot Vance was beginning, for the first time in his life, to understand who the someone else had been. It had been him. He did not reveal himself. This is important, and it is the part that separates recognition from rescue. A lesser man, a man in a worse story, would have shown up at her door the next morning with a check and a camera crew and the terrible generosity of the powerful. Elliot did not. Partly because he did not yet have the whole truth and would not move on half of it. But partly because some instinct, maybe the one Diane had left in him, told him that this was a woman who would not be rescued, and that showing up with a check would be its own kind of erasure, turning the person who saved his life into a charity case, a line item of a different kind. So he did the only thing he could think to do that would let him stay near her without turning her into a story. He booked her car. Night after night he called for rides he did not need. He would take a car from the penthouse to a hotel and sit in the lobby for an hour and take another car back, and some of those cars were hers, because he had learned her patterns, the corridors she worked, the hours she drove. He did not talk much. He was a quiet, wrecked, gray man in the back seat who tipped well and asked her nothing, and she thought he was just another insomniac with money and grief, because the city was full of those, and she had driven 100 of them. But he watched. Not her, that would have frightened her. He watched her hands. He watched her check the baby at red lights. 2 fingers. The pulse she did not need to check. He watched her count her own tips at the end of a corridor without ever letting the count show on her face. He watched her turn down a fare that was too far from where the baby's overnight sitter was, doing the math out loud to herself, and he understood that she did math constantly the way he did, except that her math was about survival and his had been about margins. And they were, he was beginning to see, the same math run from opposite ends. Tenants were numbers on a spreadsheet. Patients were numbers on a spreadsheet. Nurses were numbers on a spreadsheet. And every single one of those numbers was a woman doing arithmetic in the dark, trying to make a column reach the other side. One night she caught him watching in the mirror. Not the watching he was hiding, just a look. And she said, in the flat kind voice she used on the wrecked ones, that he looked like a man carrying something. He said he was. She said everybody in her car at 2 a.m. was carrying something. That was the only kind of person out at that hour. And then she said the thing that undid him, without knowing what she was saying or to whom. You don't have to carry it alone, you know. Even if it's just to a stranger in a car. Somebody should stay with you in it. Somebody should stay. He did not answer. He did not need to. He looked out the window at Kensington, going by in the dark, and he thought about Diane, and he thought about a gloved hand on his wrist 6 years ago, and he thought about the fact that the woman saying this to him, offering, for free, to a stranger, the one thing his billions had never once bought him, was the same woman his company had thrown away. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Then he did the first thing. The quiet thing. The thing he thought was safe. He paid her back rent. All of it, the $3,847 and the next 2 months on top, cleared through the management company anonymously, no name, no note, just a balance that went from 3 months behind to current overnight. He thought he was being careful. He thought he was being invisible. He thought a woman drowning in a number would simply be grateful the number was gone. He did not understand her yet, because Nita Das did not feel rescued. She felt watched. She got the notice from Landmark that her balance was cleared, paid in full, and she stood in the hallway of Unit 4B holding it, and the first thing she felt was not relief. It was fear. Money does not appear. Not in her world. In her world, money is earned in $41.60 increments across 11-hour nights, and when $3,847 appears out of nowhere, it is not a gift. It is a hook. And she had spent enough of her life around men with money to know that a hook always has a line attached, and the line always leads back to a hand that wants something. She thought about the men it could be. She made a list standing there in the hallway. An ex. A lawyer. A landlord playing an angle she couldn't see yet. Someone from the old lawsuit. She went through them one by one, the way she used to run a differential on a patient. Rule this out, rule that out, and none of them fit, and the not fitting was worse than any of them fitting would have been. A danger you can name, you can plan for. A danger you cannot name just sits in the room with you. She called the management company. They would not tell her. She pushed. She was good at pushing. She had pushed doctors twice her seniority to make calls that saved lives. And she got a junior clerk to admit it had come through a third party, a corporate account, and to read her, before a supervisor took the phone, the first 4 letters of the account name, VANC. She did not know what it meant. But she wrote it on the back of the same envelope where she did her arithmetic, under the column that never reached the other side, and she looked at it, and something in her went cold and still and certain, the way it used to go before she made a call on a dying patient. She did not know Elliot Vance's name. But she knew, the way you know a monitor is about to alarm before it does, that the appearing money was connected to the quiet gray man in the back seat who watched her hands. And she made a decision that would have broken a weaker woman's story in half. She decided to stop driving. Not forever. But she pulled the app offline. She sat in her paid-up apartment that she could not trust. She told Wendell she needed a few days, and she did not tell him why, because the why sounded insane. A stranger paid my rent and I'm frightened of it, and only a woman raised by Ozella Doss would understand that a gift you did not earn and cannot explain is more dangerous than an eviction you can. An eviction at least you can see coming. It has a date on it. It has a form number. This had nothing. This was just a hand in the dark, closing over her life, and she could not see whose it was. Meanwhile, 140 blocks and one whole world away, the thing Elliot could not finish thinking was about to arrive with a name and a face, because a woman named Denise Okafor had seen his inquiry cross a desk it was not supposed to cross. Denise had been the charge nurse at Delray General 6 years ago. She had been on the floor the night Elliot's heart stopped, and she had watched Renata Doss catch the bleed. And she had watched, 2 years after that, as a reconciliation memo came down from a staffing subsidiary and quietly ended Renata's career over an insubordination that Denise knew for a fact was the exact escalation that saved a man's life. Denise had said nothing at the time. She had a pension and 2 kids in college and a mortgage. And saying something was a luxury she had told herself she could not afford, and she had lived with that arithmetic for 4 years, the way you live with a stone in your shoe, you have stopped being able to feel. But she had kept a copy. She did not know why she kept it. She told herself it was habit. But there is a kind of person who keeps the proof of a wrong they were too afraid to stop, and keeps it not as evidence but as penance, a stone carried, so you do not forget the shape of your own silence. Denise Okafor had kept a copy of the escalation note, the real one, the unvoided one, with a name on it, and the sign-off and the signature. For 4 years it had lived in a manila folder in the back of a file cabinet in her spare room, behind the tax returns and the kids' old report cards. She knew exactly where it was. She had not looked at it once. She did not need to look at it. She could see it with her eyes closed. Renata Doss Aron. The date. The catch. The commendation-adjacent flag. And underneath, the reconciliation order that turned a life saved into an act of insubordination, and the signature on that order, a signature Denise had recognized then and had spent 4 years pretending she had not. She had watched Renata pack her locker the day it happened. She had not helped. She had stood in the break room doorway with her coffee and watched a 9-year nurse, the best nurse on that floor, the one who stayed, the one who caught the things, carry a cardboard box to her car, and Denise had said nothing because she had a pension and 2 kids in college and a mortgage, and saying something was a luxury she had told herself she could not afford. She had lived with that arithmetic for 4 years the way you live with a stone in your shoe you have stopped being able to feel. Present but silent. Always there. And when a quiet inquiry from Vance Meridian's own chairman came looking, 6 years later, for a scrubbed night at Delray General, Denise Okafor sat at her kitchen table and understood that the stone in her shoe had finally, after 4 years, become a thing she could set down. She went to the spare room. She opened the cabinet. She took out the folder, and she sat with it a long time, and then she did the thing she should have done 4 years earlier. She picked up the phone. Somebody stays, Ozella used to say. Sometimes it takes a person 4 years to figure out what they stayed for. Denise Okafor's call reached Elliot Vance on a Tuesday, and it gave him the one thing he did not have. It gave him the how. He had the shape already, the scrubbed night, the erased nurse, the reconciliation timestamp from his own division. What he did not have was the story that connected the woman who saved his life to the woman driving a rideshare car through Kensington at 2 in the morning. Denise gave it to him. She sat across from him in a conference room she had no business being comfortable in. A charge nurse with 30 years on hospital floors, sitting in a glass tower 40 floors up. She laid a manila folder on the table, and she told him what had happened to Renata Das. It was the night he coded. That was the whole thing, laid bare, and it was worse than he had let himself imagine. The escalation that saved his life, the catch, the forced call, the bleed found in time, was the exact act for which Renata Das had been fired. Not fired for a mistake. Fired for the catch. Because catching it meant going over a resident's head, and going over a resident's head meant an incident report. And an incident report on a floor running his brother's optimized coverage was a liability. Because if you write down that a nurse had to override a doctor to prevent a death, you have also written down that the floor was too thin to catch the death any other way. And Vance Meridian's staffing subsidiary did not keep records like that. It reconciled them. So they flagged her. Insubordination. A nurse who would not stay in her lane. They built a file. Not overnight. They were patient about it. The way institutions are patient when they have decided to remove someone. And over the 2 years that followed, they documented every instance of Renata Das doing exactly the thing that made her the best nurse on the floor. She stayed past her shift to sit with a dying man who had no family. Unauthorized overtime, a note in the file. She overrode a resident's call on a patient who was crashing. Insubordination, a note in the file. She reported a night when the floor ran 1 nurse to 11 patients. Not a team player, a note in the file. She refused to sign a staffing sheet she believed was unsafe. Difficult, a note in the file. Every act of staying became a line. The file grew the way her arithmetic grew, 1 entry at a time in a column that only ran one direction. And then the file became a termination. The termination became a lawsuit she filed and could not fund. A lawyer wanted a retainer she did not have. The ones who worked on contingency did the math on a single mother suing a company with Vance on the buildings, and stopped returning her calls. The lawsuit became a settlement offer, low, with a non-disclosure attached, and she refused it. Refusing meant agreeing in writing that catching the bleed had been the error. Refusing was the only dignity she had left. The refusal became a licensing dispute that dragged. The dispute became a hold on her credentials. And the hold became a license that lapsed 14 months ago. Quietly, on a Tuesday, in an email she read in a parking lot, while she was driving nights to feed 2 children. That is how you erase a person. Not all at once. You do it the way water does it. 1 line at a time. Here is where the story stops again, because the mechanism is not invented. In the United States, a professional license is a lifeline and a leash at the same time. A registered nurse whose license lapses in a dispute cannot simply work somewhere else. She is locked out of the only career she trained 9 years for. The alternative is what economists politely call the gig economy, and what everyone in it calls staying alive 1 fare at a time. And the debt that follows a person out of that career does not stay in one place. It spreads. Medical debt, which roughly 1 in 5 American households carries, even insured ones, averaging around $4,600, is one of the most powerful predictors of losing your housing. Adults who take on medical debt are more than twice as likely to become unable to pay their rent or mortgage, and nearly 3 times as likely to face eviction or foreclosure. The bill and the eviction are not 2 separate misfortunes. They are the same event, arriving in installments. Renata Das was not unlucky. She was processed. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point. Elliot listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When Denise finished, she slid the folder across the table, the real escalation note, the unvoided one, with the name and the sign-off and the signature, and Elliot Vance looked down at the signature and went very still. The way a man goes still when the last piece of a thing he did not want to be true clicks into place. The signature on the order to bury the note that saved his life belonged to his brother, Gregory. He did not raise his voice when he confronted him. That was not the Vance way, and it would not have suited the size of the thing. He went to Gregory's office. The good coffee, the view, the same view Elliot had, 1 floor down, as if the building itself had been designed to remind Gregory he was 1 floor down, and he set the folder on the desk, and he asked one question. He asked if Gregory knew whose life the buried escalation had saved. Gregory did what Gregory did. He reached for the language that had protected him his whole career. He said it was routine. He said it was cleanup from the subsidiary consolidation. He said every large operation reconciles legacy records, and that if Elliot wanted to audit 6 years of paperwork, he was welcome to, but that he should understand what legacy ratios would have done to the margins. He said the word margins the way other men say the word family. He said he had built the most efficient staffing operation in the sector. He said he was being punished for being good at his job. He said a great many things, in the flattened language money uses when it does not want to look at itself, and Elliot let him say all of them, and then Elliot said 2 words, Renata Doss. Gregory said it did not ring a bell. And that was the truth, and it was the worst thing about him. It did not ring a bell. He had processed her, flagged her, built the file that ended her, signed the order that buried the proof, and he could not remember her name, because she had never been a name to him. She had been a line item, a reconciliation, a liability handled. Elliot looked at his brother, not remembering the woman he had destroyed, and he understood that this was how it always worked, that the machine did not require hatred to run, only forgetting, only the ability to not remember the person on the other end of the optimization. So Elliot told him. He told him that the nurse he could not remember was the nurse who had caught the bleed the night. Elliot's heart stopped on a floor running Gregory's optimized coverage. He told him that Gregory had spent 6 years operating the machine that saved his brother, and then, one patient line at a time, dismantled the person who did the saving. He told him that the same lean ratios that built both their fortunes were the ratios that had, on another understaffed night 2 years later, left Diane deteriorating in the dark with no one in the room to read the monitor. He said Diane's name and Gregory stopped talking. Because this is the thing about a system with a human face. The face does not think of itself as cruel. Gregory Vance had not hated Renata Doss, he had never met her. He had not wanted Diane to die, he had wept at her funeral. He had simply built a machine that ran on people staying and punished the ones who stayed. He had never once had to stand on the floor where the machine did its work. And so he had been able to believe for his whole career that the numbers were just numbers. Elliot had believed it too. That was the unbearable part. They had built it together. One of them had just been forced at last to see the floor. The cascade started the next morning, and it started with a clerk who could not sleep. Tomas Reyes-Lin had processed the void. He had recognized the signature and archived the file and told himself it was routine, and he had not slept right since. And when the chairman himself began pulling threads on a scrubbed Delray night, Tomas understood that the thing he had helped bury was coming up, and that he could come up with it or be buried under it. He was not brave exactly. The story should be honest about that, the way it was honest about Gregory. Tomas had a lease. He had a student loan. He had a job in a building where you did not read names closely, and he had read this one, finally, at 3 a.m. at his own kitchen table, and he had not been able to unread it. Renata Doss Arn. A commendation flag reclassified as insubordination. A life reclassified as a liability. He had known for 2 years and said nothing, and the nothing had a weight, and the weight had a name. But there is a moment for the weak accomplice, when the cost of staying silent finally rises above the cost of speaking. Tomas reached his on a Wednesday. He copied the audit trail. All of it. The reconciliation orders, the timestamps, the deletion logs, the metadata that showed a life-saving escalation being reclassified as insubordination by name and by hand. He copied it onto a drive. He carried it up to the 40th floor in his coat pocket like something that might go off. And he set it on Elliot Vance's desk, with his hands shaking, and said he should have said something 2 years ago. Elliot told him the truth. Almost nobody says something 2 years ago. Saying it now was not nothing. It was not everything. But it was not nothing. And in a story about who stays, the difference between nothing and not nothing is the entire distance a person can travel. And then it chained, the way these things chain when the top of the tower finally decides to look down. The audit trail triggered an internal investigation. The investigation confirmed the pattern. Not one nurse, it turned out, but a documented practice across the subsidiary. Reclassifying safety escalations as performance problems. Building files on the nurses who reported thin floors. Making the people who stayed disappear so the ratios could stay lean. It had a shape and a scale. Compliance counted the files. There were more than 40. 40 nurses across 6 years, across a dozen hospitals. Each one flagged for some version of the same crime, staying when the spreadsheet said to move on. 40 careers reconciled. 40 people who had done the thing Ozella Doss taught her granddaughter to do, and been erased for it, one line at a time. The board, which had loved Gregory's numbers, discovered what the numbers had cost. And boards do not love a cost they can be sued for. Legal got involved. Compliance got involved. Outside counsel got involved. The machine that had been so patient about erasing one nurse turned out to be very fast once it decided to, about erasing the man who ran it. Gregory was placed on leave within the week. His division was frozen pending review. The optimized coverage contracts that had been his life's work were pulled, one hospital at a time, and rewritten with the legacy ratios he had spent a career eliminating. Because it turned out that when the liability was counted honestly, the 2 extra nurses per floor were cheaper than the deaths. But all of that, the investigation, the board, the 40 files, the restitution being drafted in a conference room Nita had never seen, all of that was still just the money. Still just the verdict. Still the part of the story that a lesser story would mistake for the ending. Elliot knew better. He had learned too late for Diane and almost too late for himself what the actual thing was. It was not the settlement. It was not the license reinstated or the rent repaid or the brother removed. Those were consequences. Consequences were the downslope. And while the tower turned, while lawyers drafted and the board convened and 40 files were counted, Nita Doss did not know any of it. She sat on Ruth Street. She watched the app icon on her phone and did not tap it. She checked the account 4 times a day, waiting for the paid rent to be clawed back, for the hook to reveal its line. She did Amara's hair for school. She fed Marcus. She signed the field trip slip, finally, because $11 was one thing she could still control, and she wanted her daughter to see something green that week that was not a number. She was, in other words, doing exactly what she had always done. Staying. Showing up. Holding the small room she had against the dark. And she had no idea that 140 blocks away, an entire empire was being taken apart because of one night 6 years ago when she had stayed. The thing itself was still out there in the dark, in a paid-up apartment she could not trust, with the app turned off and the letters VANC written on the back of an envelope, frightened of a hand she could not see. And she still did not know. That was what he could not stand. She had saved his life on a night when the floor was too thin to save it any other way, and for that single act she had been documented and flagged and terminated, sued into silence, stripped of her license, and pushed out into the dark to drive strangers for $41.60 a night. All of it done by the company that bore his name, so a spreadsheet could stay lean. And through every mile of it she had never once known the truth. The wrecked gray man she kept offering to sit with in his grief was the very life her staying had kept. Somebody had to go and tell her. In person. Not a check. Not a clerk. Not a press release. Not a company doing its accounting. Somebody had to stay in the room while she heard it. The way she had stayed in the room for a stranger 6 years ago on the worst night of his life. The way nobody had stayed for Diane. Elliot Vance got his coat. He found her on a corner in the rain. Not at her door. He understood by then that a knock at the door of Unit 4B from a man in a coat that cost more than her car would land as a threat, not a mercy. He found her the way she had first found him, in the in-between, in the dark, in the working hours nobody chooses. She had turned the app back on that night because the fear of the mystery money had finally lost to the arithmetic of 2 children, and she was parked at the corner of Ruth and Cambria, under the one streetlight that still worked, waiting on a fare, when a car she did not recognize pulled up and a man got out into the rain. She knew him before he spoke. The gray man. The one who watched her hands. She rolled the window down 2 inches, the way you do when you have decided to be brave and have not yet decided it is safe, and she asked him what he wanted, and there was steel in it. The steel Ozella put in her, the voice that had told a billionaire's brother's company for 2 years that it could take her job but it could not make her sign that the catch had been a crime. She asked him if he was the one, if he was the hand, if he was the thing that had closed over her life and paid her rent and been sitting in her back seat learning her patterns. She was not grateful. She was furious and frightened and magnificent, and she wanted to know what he wanted from her. And Elliot Vance stood in the rain and told her the truth. He did not lead with the money. He did not lead with the company or the investigation, or his brother, or any of the machinery. He led with the only thing that mattered, and he said it plainly, the way you say the thing you have waited 6 years to say. He told her that 6 years ago, at Delray General, on a night the floor was too thin to save him any other way, his heart had stopped, and a nurse he never saw had taken his wrist with 2 fingers and caught a bleed. 3 residents missed and forced the call that kept him alive. He told her he had felt that hand for 4 seconds and spent 6 years looking for it. He told her he had found it at a red light on Frankfurt Avenue, checking a baby's pulse. He told her it was her. That she had saved his life and never known it, and been destroyed for it by the company that bore his name, and that he had come. Not to pay her, not to fix it, those were coming and they were not the point. He had come to stand in front of her in the rain, and let her see that the life she saved had a face, and that the face knew what she had done. And then he said it. The thing the whole story had been walking toward. You were the one who stayed. He said it and his voice broke on it. I have spent 6 years looking for the hand that caught it. And you've been out here every night, in the dark, catching everyone but yourself. You stayed for me when nobody was paying you to, when nobody would have known if you hadn't, when staying was the thing that cost you everything. And I couldn't even remember to look for you until you saved a baby in your own back seat right in front of me. The rain came down. She did not say anything. She did not need to. So I'm going to tell you the thing my wife never got to hear anyone say, because there was no one in the room to say it. He was crying now, openly, a 58-year-old billionaire standing in the Kensington rain. I see you. I see what you did. It mattered. You matter. And you have been carrying all of it alone, and you don't have to anymore. You stayed for me. Now let somebody stay for you. Let somebody stay for you. That was the reversal. That was the whole engine of the thing turning over at last. For 34 years, Renata Doss had been the one who stayed, for the dying, for the patients, for a stranger on a table, for 2 children in the dark, for a coffee can block that she would not let repay her. Somebody stays. It had been her whole identity and her whole ruin. And now, on a corner in the rain, a man was standing in front of her offering to be for once the somebody who stayed for her. Not to rescue her. To stay with her in it. The exact thing she had offered him, for free, in the back of her car, when she thought he was just another wrecked stranger carrying something. She put her face in her hands. The window came the rest of the way down, and she let herself, for the first time in 4 years, not be the one holding the room. She did not fall apart the way people fall apart in movies. She was too much herself for that. What happened was smaller and truer. Her hands, the hands he had watched for a dozen nights, the hands that checked a baby's pulse and counted tips and did arithmetic in the dark, the hands that had once taken a stranger's wrist and refused to let go. Her hands came down from her face, and they were shaking, and she looked at this man standing in the rain, ruining a coat that could have paid her rent for a year. And she asked him one thing. She asked him what the nurse's name was. The one who died alone. His wife. He said Diane. And Nita Doss, who had every reason on earth to think about herself in that moment, her rent, her license, her children, the years she had lost, did the thing that had gotten her fired and gotten him saved and defined every hour of her life. She reached through the window and took his hand. 2 fingers to the wrist, the old habit, the pulse she did not need to check. And she said, I'm sorry nobody stayed with Diane, and she stayed with him in the rain in it for as long as it took. Because that was the whole job. That was the only thing she had ever known how to do. This was the peak, not what came after. This, not the money, not the license, not the settlement or the brother or the tower coming down. A woman being told by the life she saved that the staying had been seen. That is the thing the whole machinery of the story existed to deliver, and everything past this point is the sound of a life getting easier, which matters, but which is not the same as the moment a person stops being invisible. Amara made the drawing again that week. The nurse, the small bed, the lamp. But this time, Anita found it on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and had to sit down. This time the bulb was colored in. Bright yellow, pressed so hard the crayon had almost torn the paper, light coming off it in every direction. Nita asked her, careful, why the light was on this time. And Amara, 7 years old, said it the way children say the truest things. Without knowing they are landing a whole story, she said, because somebody's staying with you now, Mama. So you can leave it on. The light left on. For her. At last. Everything else was the downslope, and the downslope was good, and the story does not pretend money is nothing. Her license was reinstated within 90 days once the reclassification was reversed, and the insubordination was entered into the record as what it had actually been, a life saved. The back rent stayed paid, and this time she let it, because it was not a hook now, it was restitution, and there is a difference, and she had always known the difference. That was the whole of who she was. Vance Meridian offered her a role. Not a settlement to go away, but a job to stay, a seat rebuilding the staffing standards of the exact system that had thrown her out, writing the ratios, naming the floors, making sure the next nurse who stayed did not get erased for it. She took it. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. Now the numbers would be on her side of the column, and the man who had erased her was erased. The unvoided note, the one Denise had carried for 4 years, and Tomas had proven, surfaced with Gregory Vance's signature on the suppression, and it did to him exactly what he had done to Renata Doss. The board removed him. His division, the optimized coverage machine, his life's work, the thing he had built to make people disappear so the ratios could stay lean, was dissolved, folded, its name struck from the org chart. The man who had made a nurse disappear one line at a time was himself made to disappear, cleanly, from the company that bore his family's name. He had taught them how. He had signed the template himself. That is the mirror. He erased the one who stayed, he was erased in turn. But here is the part the outside world got wrong when the story leaked, the part that matters most, and the story has to say it plainly. The billionaire did not save her. The block saved her first. Long before Elliot Vance ever got out of a car in the rain, Big Wendell had kept a coffee can on his counter and a 7-year-old on a milk crate with a juice box he did not charge for. Miss Pearl had folded a 20 into a church envelope with no name on it. Somebody had left a bag of groceries outside Unit 4B one night and never said who, a yellow box of Cheerios, a gallon of milk, a package of the little clementines Amara loved. Somebody had covered a shift at Wendell's so Nita could sleep 4 hours. Somebody had walked Amara to school the week the car was in the shop. The 1900 block of Ruth Street had been staying for Renata Doss the entire time. Quietly, without cameras, without a tower coming down, the way Kensington had looked after its own for 100 years before anyone rich ever noticed. Elliot Vance did not rescue her. He caught up. He was the last one to arrive at a thing the neighbors had been doing all along, and the most he could honestly say for himself was that when he finally understood who had stayed for him, he found a way to stay back. Somebody stays. It was never about the billionaire. It was about a grandmother at an overnight desk, and a nurse who caught a bleed, and a block that kept a can, and a little girl who finally got to color the light in. All of them, in the dark, staying. This story is fictional. Renata Doss is not a real person. Neither is Elliot Vance, nor his brother, nor the night at Delray General. But the systems it describes are real, and they are not gentle. Right now, tonight, somewhere in America, a nurse is staying past her shift on a floor that is too thin to be safe, because the alternative is leaving a body alone in the dark, and she was raised not to. Right now, a mother is doing arithmetic on the back of an envelope, feeding her children first, and eating nothing, watching a number that will not reach the other side. And right now, in a court somewhere, a landlord is filing a piece of paper that will follow a family for years. Here is what is real. In a typical year, landlords file roughly 3.6 million eviction cases in the United States, around 1 for every 14 renter households. About 2.7 million households get an eviction filing each year, and a typical case involves one child. Some 2.9 million children a year live through it. Nearly half of American renters, a record high, now spend more than they can afford on rent. And the burden does not fall evenly. Black women, especially black women raising children, are listed on eviction filings at rates well above everyone else. These are not people who failed. Most of them, like the woman in this story, were doing everything right, one line at a time, in the dark, until a system that runs on people staying decided that staying was a cost it could no longer carry. You are not powerless in front of that, and neither is your neighbor. If you or someone you know is facing an eviction, a shutoff, or a medical bill that has become a housing crisis, there are real places to start. You can dial 211 to reach local help with rent, utilities, and food. Programs like LIHEAP help with heating and utility costs. Local legal aid organizations and eviction diversion programs like the one in Philadelphia can put a lawyer beside a tenant who would otherwise stand in that courtroom alone. The eviction lab at Princeton tracks where the crisis is worst so that it cannot be ignored. And for the nurses, for anyone whose license became a leash, reinstatement and loan repayment programs exist to get trained people back into the rooms that need them. None of that is charity. Remember the whole point of the story. There is a difference between charity and staying, and the difference is everything. Charity looks down. Staying looks across. Because care was never a feeling. It is who is still in the room at 3 in the morning. And a system that runs on the people who stay, the nurses, the grandmothers, the neighbors with a coffee can, and then punishes them for staying is not broken. It is working exactly as designed for someone else. The only question the story ever asked is whether we are willing to be the someone who stays. Somewhere tonight, a woman is out in the dark, catching everyone but herself. Be the one who stays. If this story stayed with you, don't share it for the algorithm. Share it for the conversation, for the nurse you know, the mother down the hall, the neighbor one bad month from the edge. Tell them somebody's staying. Tell them they can leave the light on.